Okay, thank you everyone for attending this session. I'm excited to walk through some of the more advanced use cases for tax calculation that we've encountered in the WooCommerce connector for AvaTax. So I appreciate the introduction, as you all know already. My name is Beka Rice. I've been building apps and plugins and extensions for e-commerce merchants since 2013. And my work was primarily with WooCommerce. Our company, Skyverge, served over 100,000 merchants. We also worked extensively with Shopify and some other ecosystems. And our team was acquired by GoDaddy in 2020. And so while my work had primarily been with WooCommerce, the cool thing about that has been expanding our horizons as a team to work on headless commerce, as well as WooCommerce as an online channel for a broader omni-channel strategy. And so as a result, we've seen some long tail or perhaps more niche use cases for sales tax that powered the WooCommerce integration that we had jointly developed with Avalara. And I'd like to walk through some of those today. And WooCommerce is a little bit unique. So if you're not familiar with it, I want to take a few minutes up front to share what is different about WooCommerce and then how that powered some of the decisions that we made with the AvaTax integration that we had built for the platform. So with WooCommerce, there's a lot you can do. It's an open source and very flexible commerce platform. It works within WordPress. So if you're familiar with WordPress, which powers a little over 40% of the websites on the internet, WooCommerce is the most popular way to add store functionality to a WordPress website. And there are benefits and trade-offs to using self-hosted or open source software. But WooCommerce has developed a unique ecosystem. And as a result, we see a few things overrepresented in WooCommerce compared to other platforms that you may be more familiar with. For example, subscriptions and recurring billing are a key competitive differentiator of WooCommerce. And so as a result, we see a lot of merchants who have subscription or membership models as part of their website. There's a very robust module that supports dozens of payment processors. So as a result, we needed to figure out how to appropriately handle sales tax for that platform, which we'll dig into as the first part of this presentation. WooCommerce is also very popular worldwide. Open source software tends to have large international awareness and contribution. WordPress is no exception to that. So there's a ton of support for translations, as well as localized extensions for payment providers or shipping providers. And as a result, WooCommerce is very popular for people who are selling cross-border. So we also have a fairly extensive integration with AvaTax's cross-border functionality that we'll take a look at as well. And WooCommerce is also very popular with B2B sellers. So wholesalers or folks who have B2B merchandising and distribution models tend to be interested in WooCommerce because of the robust customer accounts and the ability to do segmented or differentiated pricing based on those accounts. So that also leads to some interesting things from a tax perspective where exemptions or business accounts can come into play. And we leveraged some exemptions and some cool extensions of functionality because WooCommerce is open source that are interesting to share. Because every merchant runs their own instance of the software, we're able to also sometimes extend or customize things with the help of agency or web developer partners, which can result in some cool adoption of features that aren't always as popular in other connectors with AvaTax. So with that in mind, let's start with subscription billing and what we've done with that use case for WooCommerce. So as I mentioned, this is one of the most popular things in WooCommerce. We have a lot of sellers who do recurring billing. And so as a result, we developed an integration between the WooCommerce AvaTax connector and the WooCommerce subscriptions module. And a lot of folks, when you have a subscription processing module extension or app, feel that you can't adjust the recurring total of a subscription, that once a customer signs up, they should pay the exact same amount in perpetuity, which is not correct. Price changes need to be clear up front, but price changes can happen. And most importantly, sales tax recalculation needs to happen. So if your platform or an integration that you're developing could potentially result in recurring billing, it's important to understand that tax recalculation should be a part of that strategy. So even if you, for example, change the price of your line items as a merchant, and that should affect renewals going forward. Obviously, the tax needs to be calculated on top of that price change. But there are other things that can change the taxability of an order. And so while a subscription may have been purchased under one set of conditions originally, we have to make sure that the taxability of future renewals are also accounted for. So for example, updates to Nexus for the business can affect taxability. If the merchant didn't operate in a particular state and therefore didn't have to collect and remit sales tax, then purchasers in that state may not have seen sales tax. But now let's say the merchant employs people in that state, or in some cases, even attending trade shows or doing pop-up shops in a state can signify economic nexus. Now those changes may require you to start collecting and remitting sales tax for those subscriptions where you haven't in the past. And so it's important that we can account for that. Similarly, there are always legislation updates, such as updates to a particular municipality's rates. They may be 6.25% today, and now they need to be 6.5%. It's important that your future renewal orders account for that. Otherwise, merchants are going to be paying that out of their own pocket, which obviously is going to upset anyone who's using your integrations with AvaTax. And changes in item taxability can also affect this. If legislation says something that was taxable is now non-taxable, or vice versa. And customer exemptions can also affect this. If a user was supposed to be exempt and now they're not, or that status has changed, we need to make sure that we're always reflecting whatever the most accurate state of taxability is at the time that renewal order or invoice is placed. So as a result, the WooCommerce subscriptions module and its popularity became something that we had to account for in detail in our integration. So let's take a look at how that operates, practically speaking, in WooCommerce. I'm going to switch over to a demo and show us how this works in action. So we can see that in WooCommerce, we have this integration installed and activated, and we have it configured to automatically enable tax calculation and to send documents to Avalara. We can decide on a lot of other features, such as address validation. And in this case, I've connected to the sandbox environment. We connect to production or sandbox to be able to test things out. Now for the WooCommerce subscriptions module, you can see here that I have an active subscription for $16.20 per month. So that recurring total is going to be based on this being a Pennsylvania address where I have Nexus. And as you can see, my item is $15, but I have a state sales tax and a county sales tax applied to that item, which were automatically calculated when this subscription was originally purchased. So my recurring total of $16.20 is correct now. But if anything changes here, such as my taxability on my items or information about my business, I need to change that. So here I'm going to add a different tax code. In Pennsylvania, apparel would be non-taxable. So if I update my tax code here, it was incorrect in the past, this item has now been updated. And what our integration does transparently behind the scenes is that anytime a subscription is renewed, there's a lot of things that have to be kicked off here, like communicating with the payment processor. And one thing we do is also check in with AvaTax to say, hey, is there any change in taxability? And we can see now that the recurring total is $15 a month instead of $16.20. And if I pull up all of the renewal orders here, the one that was just processed, we can see has a different recurring total than the orders that were placed before that. And that's because of that change I made to the item's taxability. So if I take a look at that order in more detail, we'll see that reflected in the renewal order. That now I don't have any sales tax associated with the item because its taxable status has been changed. So even though the original order had one set of information, if the circumstances change, we need to make sure that the taxability of that is accounted for so that merchants are always abiding by whatever the most recent taxability would be for the order. So let's go ahead and move back. And take a look at the other use cases that we've seen in WooCommerce. We've also seen cross-border be a big part of the WooCommerce ecosystem. So what does that mean? It's calculating duties and tariffs when merchants sell from one country into another country. So as we mentioned earlier, this is also a very popular use case with WooCommerce. We have a lot of folks who are in one country selling to multiple countries, and the fact that they can even support localized payment or shipping methods is a big part of why they do that on this platform. The integration we have is simple and effective. You can, as a merchant, configure the target countries that you're selling to for cross-border and sync item classification codes for the items you sell with those countries. And then we can assess what the duties and tariffs should be and charge them at checkout. Or we can show what the estimated duties are to the user. Now, prior to this integration, this was a very cumbersome process, right? So if I sell to 10 countries with 10 products, I have a Cartesian matrix of how many item codes I may have to account for, all right? So for every single SKU I have to get a harmonized tariff code for each of those SKUs, depending on which countries I'm going to sell to. So what a lot of merchants did is they didn't even bother to account for this in their checkout process. They would allow someone to check out. And then once they understood what the total international shipping costs and tariffs and fees would be, then they would contact the customer and say, okay, it was X, but now we're going to charge you Y to account for these things as the importer of record. And now we're going to charge your card with this total. And that could result in abandonment because either you have to go ask the customer to check out again, essentially for the difference or to give you a new authorization, or you have to have a payment processor that allows you to capture more than an authorized total, which can be very difficult to find in the e-commerce world. And so as a result, this would often be cumbersome for people who were selling cross-border because they would never know at the time of purchase what the total amount that should be charged would be. So what we do is allow merchants to just handle all of that transparently. So let's take a look again at what this looks like inside of WooCommerce. So now going back to my settings, we can see again that this module is configured inside of WooCommerce. And I have cross-border classification as something I can enable here. I will transparently sync products for cross-border duties, depending on which countries are enabled. So for each of these countries, every SKU is going to get synced and get a harmonized tariff code. All of this happens without the merchant having to do a single thing. Once they decide to start selling, their products are transparently synced. So every single one of these SKUs is going to be sent to Avalara with its unique identifier. And then it's going to have a harmonized tariff code returned for every one of the countries that should be applied to cross-border selling. This will use information such as tax codes or descriptions, shipping weight, and other information that's available for the product, and transparently sync them and fetch codes. Once those are synced, we can see the impact of that on checkout then. My site is configured so that I am the importer of record. And so as a result, I'm going to collect duties up front. And so when I start to fill out checkout in the United States, I have domestic shipping as well as domestic sales taxes applied to this cart. But if I now look at purchasing from a different country, one that I should assess cross-border fees on, now when I change this to United Kingdom, you'll see the WooCommerce checkout start to update as I get more information about the address being used to purchase these items. And as I fill out the checkout process, we're going to get those calculations back from AvaTax based on the harmonized tariff codes that we have for these line items. And then we're going to add them as fees to the order. So now I have my international shipping available, and I have the tax rates and duties that should be assessed on this order added to the total upfront, so that as the merchant, I can just capture those funds without having to come back to the customer at a later time and essentially almost renegotiate the price of the order. It's all transparent and seamless, and it's charged as part of their order. Now I can just simply capture that later or immediately process this charge instead as a result. If I didn't want to add these fees directly to the order, I could also instead just show the user an estimated amount. So if they're going to be the importer of record instead, which I can configure in my Avalara account, they will see an estimate saying, okay, at the time this goes through customs, you will have an anticipated set of $13 in duties and fees that you will need to pay for this item. And so at least we can avoid surprising the customer with what the total amount of tariffs will be when they receive the item. And so we have a lot of flexibility in the way that cross-border is applied here, and it can drastically simplify the way that merchants are assessing duties and fees and the way they sell cross-border. Now, this one was also interesting. If we come back to my presentation, because of the way all of this has to happen behind the scenes. So just one word of caution for folks who are integrating with these APIs. As I said earlier, there's essentially a Cartesian matrix of codes that you're going to have to sync. So one of the things we did have to be mindful of in WooCommerce was the performance impact of doing so. This would, let's say, apply to Magento or other self-hosted software too, where if I have only 10 items, but 10 countries, that's now 100 codes that I have to sync. So when we planned this integration with the Avalara team, we made sure to effectively handle these background tasks in batches and make sure that site performance was unaffected. So if you're also building in the open source ecosystem, just something to be mindful of there is that there's going to be more data synchronization than you realize taking place, and to account for that when you're planning your integration. So I know that we're getting close on the time that we have. So the last thing I wanted to go over, without a demo, but just to share some of what we've seen from B2B and wholesale customers is around customer exemptions. And so again, this is a very popular part of WooCommerce. We have folks who sign up and they have, direct to consumer sales, but they also have wholesale that they're doing through their website. And that's a fantastic part of Woo, that you can just set those prices dynamically when someone's logged in or logged out. And so occasionally, those folks may be exempt from sales tax, depending on what you're selling and who you're selling to. And so a lot of people will handle that in Avalara. There's an area where you can enter a specific customer for exemption, and you enter the customer code. We use the billing email address as a customer code. And if you have that configured in the Avalara account, WooCommerce will match that. It passes up the customer code to make sure that the exemption, if it's stored in Avalara, will be read, and that the tax is registered appropriately as zero or reduced tax on the order. But you don't always have a one-to-one relationship with B2B. So for example, we have a lot of folks on their WooCommerce store, there will be a business account that multiple people on the team will log into. And so that account is what should own the exemption data. So we also leveraged WooCommerce's baked-in customer accounts to also allow local exemptions to be saved. So what we do is, this left screenshot is an example of that. On the right, you can add customer exemptions in Avalara. But on the left, you can go into the WooCommerce settings area and configure a taxability status for a specific account. And so even if those exemptions aren't upstream in the Avalara account, but I know everyone from this local public school will log into this account for their purchasing, now I can have that exemption set here in WooCommerce, and that will override the taxability of that order in Avalara. And the ability to also have a local override opened up some really cool customization opportunities, which is the third thing here. So the other great thing about WooCommerce being open source is that every instance of every website can be customized and run kind of modifications to the software if they want to. So we had a number of agencies who would represent folks, let's say, who sold to public schools or other government organizations, and said, hey, we don't want to do group accounts like that. We want to be able to have everyone who creates an account have their own exemption. And this was a really cool thing that I would encourage folks to look into if your platform or your integration is also going to cover a B2B use case, where what many of these agencies did was say, okay, when someone registers an account and it has, let's say, a .gov or .edu email address, or it's from a particular set of domains that we're going to support exemptions for, once that account is verified, we want to automatically configure those settings over here on the left side. So if I register with, myschool.edu email address, now I'm automatically going to have the appropriate tax exemption applied because I know that person is part of an organization that I recognize. And so getting a little bit more advanced with exemptions was something that other folks may not have run into in their platforms, and was something that we found to be really valuable within the WooCommerce ecosystem, and something then that we had put under consideration to actually add into the core software, given these customizations taught us a lot about this use case. So something I would also encourage other developers to think about is how you might broadly handle exemptions, especially based on email or hierarchical business, and then subsequent user accounts in your purchasing. So those are 3 use cases that we found really interesting. And I thank you for coming and learning about those a bit more. If you want to view the Avalara plugin, you can do so on WooCommerce.com. And in particular, I'd encourage you to check out the way the cross-border selling is implemented, because I think the WooCommerce use case is one that is a really cool and widely used implementation of that feature in AvaTax. So thank you again, and I hope you took away a nugget of information to use in your own integrations.